There's a sequence that has destroyed every dominant empire in recorded history. Not some of them, every single one. Rome took 500 years to build the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever seen, then disintegrated. The Spanish Empire conquered 2 continents and controlled the world's wealth for a century, then collapsed into irrelevance. The British Empire spanned a quarter of the Earth's surface and ruled the seas for 200 years, then dissolved in a single generation. The Soviet Union rose from agrarian poverty to nuclear superpower in 30 years, then ceased to exist in 72 hours. Each empire followed the same trajectory. Each believed it was exceptional. Each thought its dominance was permanent. And each was destroyed by the exact same pattern. The United States became the world's sole superpower in 1991. That was 34 years ago. And right now, in 2025, America is exhibiting every symptom of late-stage imperial decay. This isn't political commentary. This is pattern recognition, a structural sequence that has repeated across 3,000 years of human civilization. And the only question that matters is whether we're perceptive enough to recognize what's unfolding, or whether we'll be the generation that says, this time is different, as the pattern completes itself. Let me show you the script, the 7 stages every empire passes through from rise to collapse. And let me show you exactly where the United States sits right now. Before we walk through the stages, you need to understand what an empire actually is. It's not just territory on a map. It's not just military strength. An empire is a system of control that extends far beyond its borders. It's the ability to shape the world according to your interests, without asking permission. Empires control 4 domains simultaneously. First, military force projection, the capacity to deploy overwhelming violence anywhere on the planet, not just defending borders, but maintaining bases, fleets, and garrisons in other people's territory. Second, economic extraction and trade route dominance, the power to dictate the terms of commerce, to control critical choke points, to tax global trade flows either directly or indirectly. Third, financial system control, the ability to create money that others must use, to set the rules of international finance, to decide who can access capital and on what terms. Fourth, narrative and cultural dominance. The empire's language becomes the language of business. Its universities educate foreign elites. Its films, music, and values become the global standard. Rome had all 4. The legions controlled the Mediterranean. Roman roads and ports structured all trade. Roman currency was the standard from Britain to Egypt, and Roman culture, its law, language, and architecture, defined civilization itself. Britain had all 4 in the 1800s. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. London controlled global commodity flows and trade routes. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. And British culture, the English language, Victorian values, British education, spread across 6 continents. The United States has all 4 right now. 750 military bases in 80 countries. The US Navy patrols every ocean. The dollar is used in 88% of international transactions. American tech companies control global information flow. Hollywood defines global entertainment. English is the language of international business. These empires look different on the surface. Different technologies, different governmental structures, different ideologies, but underneath, they operate on the same logic. Extract resources from the periphery, maintain order through force, use financial and cultural tools to make the system seem natural and inevitable, and eventually, overextend. The pattern doesn't care about the specifics, it cares about the structure, and the structure always breaks in the same way. Stage 1. Violent rise and consolidation. Every empire begins the same way, through violence, not defensive wars, aggressive, expansionist, overwhelming military campaigns that shatter competitors and establish unchallengeable dominance. Rome in the Punic Wars, 264 to 146 BC. They fought Carthage for control of the Mediterranean. 3 wars spanning a century. The final war ended with Rome burning Carthage to the ground, salting the earth so nothing would grow, and selling the entire population into slavery. This wasn't defense. This was annihilation. After Carthage, no power could challenge Rome in the Mediterranean. They spent the next 200 years conquering everything from Britain to Mesopotamia. The violence established the foundation. The terror created the empire. Spain in the 1500s consolidated through the Reconquista, and then the conquest of the Americas. They expelled the Moors, unified the Iberian Peninsula, and then unleashed conquistadors on 2 continents. Cortés destroyed the Aztec Empire with 500 men. Pizarro toppled the Inca with even fewer. Not through diplomacy, through treachery, superior weapons, and willingness to commit atrocities that shocked even their contemporaries. Spanish violence extracted the gold and silver that funded a century of European dominance. The empire rose on rivers of indigenous blood. Britain's rise came through naval warfare and colonial subjugation from the 1600s through the 1800s. They fought and defeated the Spanish Armada. They crushed the Dutch in a series of trade wars. They conquered India through the East India Company's private armies. The British Empire wasn't built by merchants making fair deals. It was built by warships, cannons, and hangings. The Opium Wars, the Sepoy Rebellion, the Boer War. British dominance came from ruthless application of military superiority against anyone who resisted. The United States achieved stage 1 through continental expansion and 2 world wars. Manifest destiny wasn't peaceful settlement. It was the systematic extermination and displacement of indigenous populations. The Mexican-American War seized half of Mexico's territory. The Spanish-American War took the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And then World War II. The US emerged as the only major industrial power with its infrastructure intact. It had produced more weapons, ships, and aircraft than the rest of the world combined. It was the only nation with nuclear weapons. The violence of World War II established American dominance more decisively than any previous empire's founding wars. This is stage 1, overwhelming military victory that eliminates rivals and establishes dominance. The United States completed stage 1 by 1945. The empire was born. Stage 2, golden age of production, innovation, and prosperity. After the violence comes the golden age. The empire's productive capacity surges, innovation flourishes, the middle class expands. This is when the empire actually works, when the system delivers prosperity not just to elites, but to ordinary citizens. Rome's golden age ran from roughly 27 BC to 180 AD. The Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace and stability. Roman engineering built aqueducts, roads, and public buildings across 3 continents. Roman law created property rights and contracts that enabled commerce. The middle class grew. Trade flourished. Cities expanded. A Roman citizen in this era had access to clean water, public baths, education, entertainment, and legal protections that wouldn't be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. This was when Rome was genuinely productive, when it built things, when it added value to the world. Spain's golden age was the 1500s, the Siglo de Oro. Spanish gold and silver from the Americas funded a cultural and intellectual renaissance. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote. Spanish universities led Europe in theology and science. Spanish art, architecture, and literature defined the era. The wealth flowing from the New World created genuine prosperity. Spanish cities like Seville and Madrid became the richest in Europe. This was Spain's moment of peak production and cultural achievement. Britain's golden age spanned the 1800s, the Victorian era. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. British factories produced more steel, textiles, and machinery than the rest of the world combined. British engineers built railroads across 5 continents. British scientists and inventors led in every field. The British middle class expanded massively. Literacy rose. Public health improved. Real wages grew. This was when British dominance was productive, when it actually created wealth rather than just extracting it. The United States had its golden age from 1945 to 1973. The post-war boom. America produced 50% of global GDP in 1945. American factories built the cars, appliances, and infrastructure that defined modern life. American universities led in science and technology. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe with American capital and expertise. The American middle class exploded. Home ownership rose from 44% to 64%. Real median wages more than doubled. A single income could support a family, buy a house, and send kids to college. This was America as a productive engine, not just a financial intermediary. Stage 2 is when the empire's dominance benefits its population. when the system generates actual wealth. But stage 2 never lasts because success breeds complacency. The empire stops producing and starts consuming. The shift is gradual but irreversible, and that's when stage 3 begins. Stage 3: financialization and imperial overreach. This is where the pattern becomes predictable. The empire shifts from making things to managing money, from production to financialization, from building wealth to extracting it. And simultaneously, the empire overextends militarily, believing its power is infinite. Rome began stage 3 after 180 AD. The empire stopped expanding. The frontiers were set, but the military expenses continued growing. Legions had to be maintained across thousands of miles. Instead of generating wealth through conquest and production, Rome began extracting wealth from existing territories through heavier taxation. And Roman elites shifted from productive activities to financial manipulation. They became landlords and moneylenders rather than builders and merchants. The economy financialized. Wealth became about owning land and collecting rents, not creating new value. Spain entered stage 3 in the 1600s. The gold and silver from the Americas kept flowing, but Spain stopped producing anything. They imported manufactured goods from the rest of Europe. Spanish nobles lived off colonial wealth without building domestic industries. The Spanish crown borrowed heavily against future silver shipments. The entire economy became about extracting and spending colonial wealth, not creating new wealth. And militarily, Spain overextended catastrophically. The Dutch Revolt, the 30 Years' War, constant wars draining resources with no strategic benefit. By 1650, Spain was militarily exhausted and economically hollowed out. Britain hit stage 3 after 1900. British manufacturing declined as industries moved to America and Germany, but London remained the financial center of the world. British wealth shifted from making things to managing investments. British capital was deployed in railroads and mines across the empire, extracting returns rather than building domestic industry. And Britain overextended militarily. By 1914, Britain was trying to maintain a global empire while facing rising powers in Europe. World War I broke Britain financially. They borrowed heavily from America. The war was won, but the cost was unsustainable. Britain's overreach in trying to maintain global dominance while industrially declining created a gap that could never be closed. The United States entered stage 3 in the 1970s and accelerated into it in the 1990s. American manufacturing began offshoring. Factories moved to Asia and Mexico. The Rust Belt died, but Wall Street boomed. The economy financialized. Wealth shifted from making things to trading assets. The financial sector grew from 4% of GDP in 1980 to 8% in 2020. Simultaneously, America overextended militarily. After the Cold War, instead of consolidating, America expanded. Military interventions in Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, then the War on Terror, Afghanistan for 20 years, Iraq for a decade. Regime change attempts in Libya and Syria. 750 military bases in 80 countries. The cost is staggering. Since 2001, the US has spent over $8 trillion on post-9/11 wars. This is overreach, projecting power everywhere with no clear strategic benefit while the domestic industrial base erodes. Stage 3 is when the empire's costs begin exceeding its productive capacity, when maintaining dominance requires borrowing and financial engineering rather than genuine wealth creation. And this leads directly to stage 4. Stage 4: internal fracture, elite capture, and political dysfunction. As the empire overextends and financializes, the internal structure fractures. Elites capture the state. They rewrite rules to benefit themselves. Inequality explodes. The middle class that thrived in stage 2 gets hollowed out, and politics becomes dysfunctional, paralyzed by competing factions fighting over a shrinking pie. Rome's stage 4 was the crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD. 50 years of chaos, 26 emperors, most assassinated. The Senate became irrelevant. Military generals seized power, held it briefly, then were killed by rivals. The empire fragmented into competing zones. Taxes soared to fund constant civil wars. The middle class was destroyed. Elites hoarded wealth and land. The political system completely broke down. It took Diocletian's authoritarian reforms to restore order, but the damage was permanent. Rome never recovered its Stage 2 stability. Spain's Stage 4 was the 1600s decline. The Spanish crown went bankrupt multiple times. The elite, the grandees, paid almost no taxes while the peasantry was crushed by tax burdens. Spanish politics became a corrupt system where court factions fought for royal favor. Innovation died. The Inquisition stifled intellectual life. The best minds left for France, Britain, and the Netherlands. Spain became a shell. The political system couldn't adapt because the elites were extracting everything they could and blocking reforms that would hurt their interests. Britain's Stage 4 unfolded between the World Wars and after World War II. The British elite, the aristocracy and financial class, remained insulated from the economic pain hitting workers. The general strike of 1926 showed the depth of class conflict. British politics polarized. The empire was dying, but the elite couldn't let go. They tried to maintain empire on the cheap, creating catastrophic decisions like the partition of India, the Suez Crisis, the Malayan emergency. British politics became consumed with managing decline while pretending it wasn't happening. By the 1970s, Britain was paralyzed. Strikes, inflation, political chaos. The elite had captured the state for generations, and when crisis came, the system couldn't respond effectively. The United States is deep into Stage 4 right now. Elite capture is nearly complete. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Corporate lobbying has essentially purchased the political system. Tax policy, regulatory policy, everything is written by and for elites. The middle class is being destroyed. Real wages for most Americans have been stagnant since 1973. Housing, education, and healthcare costs have exploded while incomes flatlined. Wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the 1920s. And politics is completely dysfunctional. Congress is gridlocked. Each party controls roughly half the population, making governance impossible. Every election is portrayed as existential because the system can't deliver basic functions anymore. Infrastructure crumbles. The national debt explodes. And nothing changes because the elite are insulated. They're doing fine. It's everyone else who's being crushed. Stage 4 is when the empire turns on itself. When internal cohesion breaks down. When the elites extract everything while the population suffers. And this creates the conditions for Stage 5. Stage 5, debt, decay, and currency debasement. When an empire can't produce enough wealth to sustain itself, it borrows. When borrowing becomes too expensive, it debases the currency. It prints money, and the physical infrastructure begins to decay because there's no capital left to maintain it. Rome's currency debasement is legendary. In 64 AD, Nero reduced the silver content in the denarius from 95% to 90%. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors kept reducing it. By 260 AD, the denarius was less than 5% silver. The currency collapsed. Prices skyrocketed. Inflation destroyed savings. Trade broke down because no one trusted Roman coins. And Rome's infrastructure decayed. The aqueducts, roads, and public buildings built in Stage 2 began crumbling. There was no money to maintain them. The empire was spending everything on the military and the bureaucracy, with nothing left for productive investment. Spain's currency debasement happened through repeated state bankruptcies. In 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647, the Spanish crown defaulted on its debts. Each default destroyed creditors and debased the currency. Spanish inflation was chronic. The silver flowing from the Americas should have made Spain rich, but instead it caused price inflation that made Spanish goods uncompetitive. And Spanish infrastructure decayed. The roads, ports, and ships that had built the empire fell into disrepair. By 1700, Spain was a second-rate power with a collapsing economy. Britain financed 2 world wars through debt and money printing. By 1945, Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio was over 250%, the pound devalued repeatedly. In 1949, a 30% devaluation. In 1967, another devaluation. Britain printed money to fund the welfare state and manage decline. Inflation in the 1970s hit 25% annually, and British infrastructure decayed visibly. The post-war period saw crumbling public housing, failing schools, and neglected transportation systems. The empire that had built railroads across continents couldn't maintain its own domestic infrastructure. The United States is living stage 5 right now. The national debt is over $36 trillion. Debt to GDP is approaching 130%, the highest since World War II. But unlike World War II, this isn't temporary war spending. It's structural: Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, interest on existing debt. It's all growing faster than revenue. The government borrows over $2 trillion per year just to maintain operations. And when borrowing got expensive in 2022 and 2023, what did the Federal Reserve do? It printed money. Quantitative easing from 2008 to 2022 created over $8 trillion. The money supply expanded faster than at any time in peacetime history. This is currency debasement, and American infrastructure is decaying. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives U.S. infrastructure a C- grade. Bridges are failing, roads are crumbling, water systems are breaking down. The electrical grid is outdated and vulnerable. The empire that built the interstate highway system and put men on the moon can't fix its own roads and bridges. Stage 5 is where the financial foundation of empire collapses, where debt becomes unpayable, where currency loses credibility, where the physical world the empire built begins falling apart, and this destroys confidence, which leads to Stage 6. Stage 6: legitimacy, crisis, and loss of external trust. An empire holds power not just through force, but through legitimacy, the belief that its dominance is natural, beneficial, and permanent. When that belief dies, when both internal citizens and external nations stop trusting the system, the empire is finished, even if the formal structures remain. Rome's legitimacy crisis culminated in the 400s. The empire split into east and west. Barbarian tribes that had been held off for centuries began settling inside imperial borders. Roman citizens stopped identifying with the empire. Local regions began governing themselves. Tax collection collapsed because people didn't believe Rome could protect them anymore. And critically, external powers stopped respecting Rome's authority. Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD. The unthinkable happened. The Eternal City was plundered. The psychological shock shattered what remained of Roman legitimacy. Spain's legitimacy crisis happened when other European powers stopped fearing Spanish military might. By the mid-1600s, France, Britain, and the Netherlands realized Spain was weak. They raided Spanish colonies with impunity. They seized Spanish territory. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 formalized Spain's decline. Spain lost the Netherlands. Its European dominance was over. And internally, Spanish subjects stopped believing in the empire. Rebellions in Catalonia and Portugal. The Portuguese successfully broke away in 1640. The empire's legitimacy, the belief that Spanish rule was inevitable and beneficial, was dead. Britain's legitimacy crisis accelerated after World War II. The colonies that had accepted British rule as civilizing missions began demanding independence. India in 1947, Palestine in 1948, Malaysia, Kenya, Cyprus. The British couldn't hold them, not because Britain lacked military force, but because the moral authority to rule was gone. British citizens stopped believing in empire. Domestically, British institutions lost credibility. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was the final blow. Britain and France invaded Egypt, and the United States forced them to withdraw. It was clear Britain was no longer a great power. It was a regional nation dependent on American approval. The United States is in early stage 6 right now. Domestically, trust in American institutions has collapsed. Trust in Congress is at 20%. Trust in media is at all-time lows. Trust in the Supreme Court has fallen. Half the country believes elections are rigged. The other half believes democracy is ending. There's no shared reality anymore. And externally, American legitimacy is eroding. The Iraq War destroyed the narrative that American intervention brings democracy. Afghanistan's collapse showed American commitments are temporary. China openly challenges American dominance in Asia. Russia ignores American red lines. Middle Eastern nations are hedging, building relationships with China and Russia rather than relying solely on America. Europe is discussing strategic autonomy, reducing dependence on American military protection. The global system isn't openly rejecting American dominance yet, but they're preparing for it. They're building alternatives, they're diversifying, they're hedging. This is what the loss of legitimacy looks like. Not a sudden revolt, a quiet withdrawal of trust and belief. Stage 6 is when the psychological foundation of empire dissolves, when no one believes anymore. And once belief is gone, all that's left is the structure. And the structure can't hold without belief. That's when stage 7 happens. Stage 7, hard decline or sudden collapse. The final stage is the collapse itself, and history shows it can happen in two ways: a long, grinding decline that takes generations, or a sudden, catastrophic implosion. Rome did the first, the Soviet Union did the second. The result is the same. The empire ends. Rome's collapse was a slow death, from roughly 400 to 476 AD. The Western Empire fragmented. Barbarian kingdoms emerged inside former Roman territory. The emperor became a figurehead. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. There was no dramatic battle. The empire just stopped functioning. The roads fell into disrepair. Cities shrank. Trade collapsed. Literacy declined. Europe entered the Dark Ages. It took 1,000 years for Europe to rebuild what Rome had achieved. The Spanish Empire declined slowly through the 1700s and 1800s. Spain lost its European territories in various wars. By 1800, Spain was a minor power. Then, in the early 1800s, Spain's American colonies rebelled. Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Argentina all gained independence. By 1830, Spain had lost almost everything. What remained was a regional European nation with no global influence. The British Empire ended in one generation. In 1945, Britain still controlled a quarter of Earth's land surface. By 1970, it was almost all gone. India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Kenya, Nigeria, dozens of colonies gained independence. Britain tried to maintain influence through the Commonwealth, but real power was gone. Britain became a medium-sized European nation dependent on American protection and American capital. The Soviet Union collapsed in 72 hours, December 1991. One day, it was a superpower with nuclear weapons and global reach. 3 days later, it ceased to exist. 15 independent nations emerged from its corpse. The collapse was total. Economic systems disintegrated. Savings evaporated. The military fractured. Borders redrawn overnight. Millions of people woke up in different countries than they went to sleep in. The United States hasn't reached stage 7 yet, but the pattern says it's coming. The question is which version? A slow decline like Britain, becoming a regional power while China or another system rises. Or a rapid collapse like the Soviet Union, where internal contradictions and external pressures create a cascading failure. The indicators suggest a slow decline is more likely. The US has advantages the Soviet Union didn't: a more diversified economy, private sector innovation, geographic security. But the pattern also shows that declines can accelerate unpredictably. Britain thought it had decades. It had 20 years. The Soviet Union looked stable in 1989. It was gone by 1991. Empires collapse faster than anyone inside them expects, because everyone inside is invested in the belief that collapse is impossible. Let's look at the numbers. The timeline of empire from peak to irrelevance. Rome lasted about 500 years from the peak of the Pax Romana to the fall of the Western Empire. The Spanish Empire lasted about 150 years from peak dominance in the 1500s to irrelevance by 1700. The British Empire lasted about 200 years from Trafalgar in 1805 to the end of empire in the 1960s. The Soviet Union lasted 69 years from the 1922 founding to the 1991 collapse. The United States achieved superpower status in 1945. That's 80 years ago. The unipolar moment, sole superpower status, came in 1991. That's 34 years ago. We are not early in the American imperial life cycle. We are late, and every symptom of late-stage decline is present. Massive debt, currency debasement, political dysfunction, elite capture, infrastructure decay, loss of legitimacy. The pattern doesn't guarantee collapse tomorrow, but it suggests we're closer to the end than the beginning. And here's what makes this different from every previous collapse. Every previous empire's fall was regional. When Rome collapsed, it affected Europe and the Mediterranean. When Spain fell, it affected the Atlantic world. When Britain declined, it affected the Commonwealth. But American dominance is global. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. American military bases are on every continent. American companies control global supply chains. American culture is global culture. When the American empire ends, there is no part of the world that won't be affected. The transition will be more chaotic, more unpredictable, and more destructive than any previous imperial collapse because the scale is unprecedented. Understanding this pattern isn't about politics. It's about survival. When empires collapse, ordinary people suffer. Savings evaporate. Standards of living drop. Security disappears. Rome's collapse triggered the Dark Ages. Literacy fell. Life expectancy declined. Trade collapsed. It took centuries to recover. Spanish collapse impoverished Spain for generations. Britain's decline destroyed the British middle class. The value of the pound fell 80% from 1945 to 1980. Pensions denominated in pounds became worthless. Soviet collapse was catastrophic for ordinary Russians. Life expectancy dropped. Savings vanished. Crime exploded. The 1990s in Russia were a humanitarian disaster. The American collapse, when it comes, will hit you in specific ways. Inflation will accelerate as the dollar loses reserve status. Your savings, if held in dollars, will lose purchasing power. Your paycheck will buy less. If you own dollar-denominated assets only, treasury bonds, dollar bank accounts, you're exposed to currency collapse. Real wages will continue declining as the productive base erodes and financialization accelerates. Jobs that produce things will disappear. Jobs that shuffle money will remain, but pay less. Social services will deteriorate as government debt becomes unsustainable. The infrastructure will continue crumbling. Security will decline as political instability increases. We're already seeing rising crime in cities, increasing political violence, declining trust in law enforcement. The point isn't to panic. Panic is useless. The point is to see the pattern. To understand that what looks like isolated problems are actually symptoms of a structural breakdown. Rising inequality isn't a policy choice. It's stage 4 of the collapse script. Currency debasement isn't a temporary measure. It's stage 5. Loss of legitimacy isn't media bias. It's stage 6. These aren't separate issues. They're connected stages in a historical pattern that has repeated dozens of times across thousands of years. So what do? First, diversify your exposure. Don't hold all your wealth in the dollar-denominated paper assets. Own things that have value across systems, real estate, productive businesses, skills that are useful regardless of regime. Learn to build things, grow things, fix things. Paper wealth evaporates. Real capabilities don't. Second, watch the indicators. Watch debt levels. Watch inflation. Watch political polarization. Watch how other nations are positioning themselves. When central banks start dumping dollars in large quantities, that's the signal that stage 7 is beginning. Third, build resilience at the local level. Empires collapse, but communities survive. Strong local networks, mutual aid, real relationships. These matter more than national politics when systems break down. And finally, understand that the pattern doesn't care about your beliefs. It doesn't matter if you think America is good or bad. It doesn't matter if you're conservative or progressive. The structural forces that destroy empires operate independently of ideology. Rome thought its values were eternal. They weren't. Spain thought its Catholic mission justified everything. It didn't save them. Britain thought its civilization was superior. It didn't stop the decline. The Soviet Union thought its ideology was scientifically inevitable. It collapsed anyway. American exceptionalism is the same delusion. The belief that we're different, that the pattern doesn't apply to us, that somehow, despite doing exactly what every previous empire did, we'll have a different outcome. We won't. The pattern is clear. The stages are documented. The United States is in stage 5, moving into stage 6. The timeline suggests stage 7 is closer than most people think. Maybe 10 years, maybe 30, but it's coming. Not as prophecy, as mathematics, as historical structure, as pattern recognition. The empire collapse script has played out dozens of times. Rome, Han China, the Caliphate, the Mongols, the Ottomans, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. Each followed the same trajectory, and each generation inside the collapsing empire refused to see it until it was too late. They had reasons, rationalizations, reasons why their empire was different, why the pattern didn't apply. They were wrong. The question is whether you'll see it, whether you'll recognize the script playing out in real time, or whether you'll be one of the people who, 20 years from now, asks how it happened so fast, why no one warned them, why they didn't see it coming. The warning is this video. The pattern is clear. The United States is following the collapse script, and history says what comes next, not as prediction, as pattern completion. The script is already written. We're just watching it play out. If this changed how you see the American empire, how you see the current moment and what's coming, then you're starting to recognize the pattern. 7 stages, every empire. And it's happening again right now. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this as it unfolds.